Good morning, honorable colleagues, dear friends, the friends of Ukraine. We have just seen a very good snapshot of what has been done and the challenges that are still in front of us. But behind these challenges and problems, there is a background. Speaking about the last 25 years, we have managed to come to be as an independent state, but at the same time, there were lots of opportunities on the way that have simply been lost. And our task today is to open up the potential on independent, sovereign and European state, a country that has all it takes to be successful, to become the symbol of change on the post-Soviet area. Because if we look at the countries that are role models to us these days, Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, these countries have not had such a close cooperation or such close ties with our past, with the Soviet past. And therefore, on the post-Soviet territory, Ukraine is the first country which is trying to change, taking the example of those countries that have proven to be successful, democratic, developed, with respect to citizens, with democratic values. And honestly speaking, when people are saying that we could have done faster, I do agree with that. The time of making reforms is very critical. The timing does matter a lot, but we have to look at what are the starting positions for these changes. Let's take 25 years. Someone could say that in 25 years Ukraine has become a real state. We did have a chance for the last 10 years to change, to transform, to happen, to become a strong independent state. But that chance, unfortunately, has been lost. If we go back to 2005, let's also remember 2010, where the changes could have happened, but the problems have gone deeper. And unfortunately, in 2014, we have lost the most valuable, the better life. And until now, starting from then, we are in resistance against Russian aggression, because Ukraine, as a free country, and Ukrainian people decided that we don't want to live in the past. We want to march forward to the future. And we have a lot of home assignments to do to make that possible. But the baseline positions are very difficult. I remember the first government, 2014, of Yatsenyuk, on the single treasury account of the 45 million state, there was a bit more than $10,000 left. At the east, we had tanks ready to fight. We had a lot of problems and a mobbed country, and we had to make rapid and necessary change to stabilize the situation. I do believe that 2016 is the year of stabilization. The next year will be the year of development. Certain progress in reforms is obvious. We have put together full sets of anti-corruption legislation. We started the deregulation. We embarked on the change of the civil service, because we think that the most important problem is the institutional weakness, the weakness of the government to address effectively the agenda. And we have seen certain progress, therefore, and I think we've been quite successful in decentralization reform. In 2014, this was the reason I came to government, to make that reform possible, and that reform is happening as we speak. However, we have a weak court, weak judiciary, other challenges which require solutions, and I do believe deeply that our future is in European Union, us becoming a strong partner of Europe, becoming a country committed to democratic values, to freedom of speech, and a developed level of economy and high standard of living. But the agenda is very intense and very full. Apart from Russian tanks, we also have a number of other strong warriors. Among them, the populism and corruption are very dangerous. And I would say that populism is not less dangerous than Russian tanks and corruption, because what we have seen, the downfall of the standard of living, the corruption of our system, our governance system, the oligarchization of the country, and many other things, they were caused by the fact that no one was thinking of how we're going to live tomorrow. Short-term interests of a given political group multiplied by populism have made our country miserable. If we look at what kind of resources we have, what kind of opportunities we have, and then we match that with what is happening and how we live today, we see this huge disbalance. That only means that something is wrong in our house. Therefore, the government that was put together, and which I'm spearheading for 5 months, it happened in April this year, began the action plan right away based on anti-corruption steps. And we didn't mean that we need to increase the gas prices tenfold. We need to introduce honest, open prices for the key energy resource. Just to give you an example, the losses or the possible loss of our independence when the price for gas were artificially lower, our production of gas was being destroyed, and at the same time, on behalf of the state, we were signing international contracts which were binding us to be slaves of Russian Federation. This is the approach which is destroying our country, our statehood. Starting from 2010 until 2013, we had unprecedented destruction from within, the destruction of the institutional capacity of the Ukrainian government. All those who live in Ukraine have seen how corruption was being cultivated, how everything was done for the courts to be barred behind. Everything was done for those who were making crimes to be free and flee from responsibility. So our task today is to make those changes possible. The changes that would give Ukrainian citizens the fair judiciary, that would provide a possibility to do the necessary reforms and ensure the economic growth, the changes that would allow and ensure the social justice. And there are these solutions out there. We don't need to invent the wheel. We just have to be diligent and committed in our work, and our government is prepared to do that work.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Prime Minister. Fascinating opening remarks, and I'm going to ask the Prime Minister a few questions. Prime Minister, is your translation kit working okay? I hope so. Good. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to the floor, because I know there are lots of people who also would like the opportunity to put a question to you. Let's start with a very basic question. You have a huge task. You know, if I just make a very short list, there's an enormous challenge of structural reform, of deregulation, the need to create an efficient and clean government. You need to root out cronyism and corruption at all the different levels of the state. You need to convince the outside world that Ukraine is a safe and productive place to invest. These are huge challenges. They can only be met by a strong leader, a leader who has a strong political base. And many Ukrainians do not believe you are that strong leader with a strong political base. What would you say to them?
Thank you very much for your question. Very basic, as you said. Well, it's about bringing back the trust to government. And I think it's openness and the outcome of our work. And that's the only thing that can convince our citizens and our international partners that we can be trusted. But I know for sure that in our politics, in the policies and decisions that the government is making. There's a full openness and transparency. And of course, we are facing with the task of reforming judiciary and honest, not faked, but honest privatization, and that's what we're going to do no matter what obstacles come. We have to address a lot of home assignments. And when we were talking about IMF, about the follow-up cooperation, our government managed in 3 to 4 months to make all it takes to continue that cooperation. But in our common program with the IMF, this is an action program for Ukraine, and Ukraine has to make its homework. So the only answer is we have to be realistic about assessing what's going on, and that what can bring the trust of people. When I was a mayor, it was basically 8 years of very difficult life, but I always valued the trust of people. And the first time I came, there were only 5% of trust of a large city of 400,000. The first election was 35% of voters, but when we have worked with our team for 5 years in the office, next time I got 78. And it's not because I was doing all my best for people to like me, because if you want to do that, you have to be on the stage with drama performances. But because I wanted to meet the expectations of people and for them to feel the changes are happening in their life and the changes are working for their benefit, not for the benefit of the government, I think that's the core of the success.
The reason I asked you specifically about your political base is that I think it's fair to say a lot of Ukrainians see you as a man who has risen to the top in Ukrainian politics because you have a long association with President Poroshenko. You're from Vinnytsia, you have known him for a long time, he clearly trusts you, and he wanted you to run this government. So coming back to the question of Ukrainian politics, you have said to us, something is wrong in our house, we still have to tackle the oligarchization of the country, we still have endemic corruption. I put it to you that you, working with your president, who is, of course, one of the biggest, most successful businessmen in today's Ukraine, does not give people confidence that you are really going to take on the cronies, the oligarchs, the people who so many Ukrainians believe are responsible for the problems in this country today.
Well, I think we'll need to look at the actions, because you can make any sort of assumptions, but I'm always saying that assumptions are very weak arguments. I have come here to serve Ukraine. I haven't come here to serve the president or to serve the oligarch groups or anyone else. I've come here to serve my state and my people, and I want to make it as open as possible with the highest efficiency. You can call it my ambition. I didn't come to government because someone else wanted me to, although, of course, together with the president, with the parliament, together with the former government, with our international partners, I want to make those changes that will have a different and better Ukraine. I think we need to put an end to all those unfairness that we have had in the last 25 years, and it's very important to believe in what we're doing, and I don't see any problems now with demonopolization of Ukraine in creating absolutely transparent market conditions in all areas, in having open and transparent privatization, having the necessary change in the judiciary, and having a fair court. That's the important change that will transform the life of people. And if we're talking about ambition and ambitious tasks and barriers, I think the ambitious tasks and aspirations of changing the Ukraine matter much more than any other difficulties that we see. And of course, you're right. No matter where you go, we start reforming, for example, the customs, or we begin sorting out things there. And the more we begin sorting it out, all of the things that have been happening there for the last couple dozens of years, we see all of these barriers being created for us. As soon as we approach honest policy on privatization, out of a sudden, there are all these obstacles that try to bring us away from our route. But I am committed to one principle. If you don't solve the problem, you become the problem. And I'll do my best not to become the problem for Ukraine and Ukrainian people.
And I guess the Ukrainian people will judge you on actions as well as words. I mean, your words are very clear and very strong. So now it's a question of actions as well. I mean, let's be fair to you, you haven't been in office so very long. But when I was last here a year ago, I challenged Prime Minister Yatsenyuk to name me one of the biggest oligarchs or one of the biggest fish in Ukraine's sort of sea of cronyism and corruption, who had been brought to justice by your judicial system. And frankly, there were no names of the biggest fish. Will you deliver these biggest names? Will you take on the vested interests at the very top? Because we all know in this room that there are people of enormous power in this country who represent the corruption and the negative aspects of this country and need to be taken on. Will you do it?
Неможливо.
It is impossible to catch a big fish with a small rod, with a thin rod. In this case, I want to tell you that a weak judicial system that was being corrupt for many, many years is now a weak spot of the efficient fight against corruption. I've been in the office for almost 5 months. Before that, I used to be the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, and I did apply efforts, as most of the MPs, to the effect of creating a Ukrainian anti-corruption legislation. Last year, they told me, "What are you talking about? What fight against corruption?" But I tell you, we have created a basis of legislative acts that do allow to fight corruption. And our task as a executive power is to do everything so that such phenomena do not arise. That's why we are liquidating corruption there, where it used to be a repetitive phenomenon. What's happening now? All the bodies that are called upon to fight against corruption are doing this. They are just embarking on their professional way. We may say that they have just finished their learning, but they are independent, they are professional enough, and the process has started. I don't know for how long the fight against corruption in Ukraine will last, but I know for sure that at the moment we are
for just a second,
witnessing
Mr. Prime Minister.
the beginning
of
the
I
process.
can't read in Ukrainian, but I can read in English. And yesterday's Kiev Post, on the front page, headline, "Trust ebbs in Lutsenko as General Prosecutor. Trust is waning in Yuri Lutsenko's performance as Prosecutor General because he has failed to fire prosecutors accused of corruption or bring any major corruption cases to trial since taking over in May." So Lutsenko is there with you. You started work pretty much together. Already, people, and I've heard it in private conversation as well, people are very worried that momentum is being lost in this fight. What are you going to do about it?
I think that you will have a chance to ask Prosecutor General about his plans, and he will probably answer. But I do think that...
Right there, because actually he was due to come today, and I was looking forward to chatting with him, and now I gather he's not coming. So maybe that tells us something. But in the end, you're the Prime Minister, you know, you run this government, and I guess it's difficult for you simply to say, oh, well, go and ask him, because you're the boss. Well, okay. But he's the boss of the government, and if the Prime Minister can't send a message and set the tone, then there perhaps is a problem with the government. I don't suggest that you should be instructing the Prosecutor General personally, but you need to set the tone.
I still don't speak English, but I do speak Ukrainian, and I tell you that's a spin. Thank you for your advice to subject Prosecutor General to the government. I think this is a good idea, but in reality I think that Yuri Lutsenko has ambitions and he would like to prove his ability in the position of Prosecutor General. At any rate, I think that the years of injustice that he came through personally lean him to the side of justice. But of course it is not enough to start investigation or frisking someone. You need to have a court verdict, and I do hope that the changes that happened in the constitution of the country, in the national legislation that pertain to the beginning of judiciary reform, will provide us an opportunity to bring professional staff, professional people into our justice system. This is very important because today, let's take the Anti-Corruption Bureau or Prosecutor General's office. When they detain people for corruption with $100,000, with $150,000, then the courts release them, and there's not a single body in Ukraine that can react to this because court in Ukraine is independent. And this is a challenge for every one of us. As head of the Constitutional Commission that was drafting changes, amendments to the Constitution, I will, of course, work in my office as Prime Minister to better implement the norms of legislation, because, of course, it is good that the laws are there, but it is very important how they are implemented. We should not lose a chance, because once we can adopt amendments to the Constitution, then we can change the status of judges, but then we have to implement the law, and it is very important how we implement it. So we will try to do this as best as possible. This is a challenge for us, and probably this is the fate. Until some time, I used to be the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, and we were, together with the government and the President, we were shaping the Ukrainian legislation, and now I'm in the executive, and I have to implement the changes that we adopted. But I want to tell all the skeptics who probably say that everything's going to be bad in Ukraine, I categorically do not agree with this. I clearly see the light in the tunnel that we are traversing now. And what we need is that those who do make decisions and on whom decisions depend believe in the future of Ukraine, and we should start to condemn the populism that is destroying our country. And we have to start to talk about what really changes the country. But this is the task for the entire Ukrainian society. I think that the time for irresponsible populist policy has passed. We have to talk professionally and responsibly, and I think that in a couple of years you'll see another video which will tell you about the continuation of the success of Ukraine.
Just a quick bit of breaking news that Thomas brought me. Mr. Lutsenko, we believe, may be here later. Unfortunately, he is going to miss my panel on corruption, but we're told he might come later in the day. So we'll see, and we do hope that he can join us at some point. Now, a final question from me, then I wanted to open it up to the floor. It just seems to me, if one looks back at the last few years of politics in Ukraine, nobody could pretend it is easy to deliver transformational change. It is extraordinarily difficult, and you pointed to the history in your opening remarks. Mr. Yatsenyuk, I think once called his own style of politics kamikaze politics, because he was determined to do as much as he could, as quick as he could, even if it destroyed himself. Well, it sort of did destroy him. Well, maybe he doesn't feel he's destroyed, but he certainly had a lot of problems. And he left office deeply unpopular and with a reform program that had not truly delivered. Tell me how you are going to be different from Mr. Yatsenyuk. What is going to be the big difference in the Groysman administration, and how will you succeed where, I suppose one might say, he ultimately failed?
Я думаю, що для кожного уряду
I think that every government faces challenges of their own, the challenges that they have to overcome. But really, I started my opening remarks with alluding to something like $15,000 on the accounts of the country. $15,000 for a country where 45 million people live, and the country that sustains a full-scale invasion by Russian aggressor, Russian troops. This needs a serious courage in taking decisions. I was often offered a job in the central government, and if not for the events of 2014, I would never go to work in the capital. But you had to do something in order to save the country. Some people do this on the front line. Some people do this producing something. And of course, these challenges were not very simple. Today, many people may easily criticize, and by this way, this is our national kind of sports. Some people just assume their jobs and they are already under the fire of criticism. By the way, we have in time tabled the draft budget for the next year, which happened in Ukraine only for the second or third time. But we did this in an honest way. We said we want a open and professional discussion about expenditures and revenues, and we have very clearly structured what we would have as a result, including social policy. And I hear the discussion of this stance. And one politician yesterday says this is the silliest budget that they were able to submit, and we will fail it. And this is a representative of one very irresponsible political force, very populistic. And I'm asking, have you seen the budget? Do you understand the philosophy of this document? I think that they have not and do not. So politicians sometimes launch the politics of destruction, but they do not understand that destroying others, they destroy themselves. They undermine the statehood of our country. And here's the greatest problem and the challenge, not a lesser challenge than we face while fighting corruption. That's why every government makes a contribution into the development of the country. Some are better, some are not. Some trends may be called successful, some not. This is natural. So the difference, I think, will be evaluated by the people when we end our term. At the start, the difference is in that the former government was the government of Yatsenyuk and the current government is the government of Groysman.
So let us have the people in this room give some sort of assessment, or at least ask a question of you, Prime Minister. Hands up, who would like to ask a question of, well, let's start with you, Alexander, and then we'll go to the back. And
Yes, I would like to first of all, thank you very much for your opinion, and I'm asking you because you are not only the Prime Minister of the government, but you are also representative of new generation of Ukrainian politicians. And the question is, what to do with Russia? How you see your relations with this big neighbor? And you know the problem is that the wife you can change, but the neighbor's not. And then what is the future? What is your such very pragmatic approach to this question? Because in my opinion, we have to be prepared for quite long time aggressive politics from Russia against Ukraine, because for Russian empire to have impact, to have influence on Ukraine is absolutely the question number one. But what is your concept? What is the concept of new generation of Ukrainian politicians? War or peace? Peace and war? What is your strategy?
Дуже коротко.
Very briefly, peace, absolute peace, but according to our conditions. Because we are not the aggressive country, we are not the aggressor. It is not us who want to seize someone else's territory. I do not agree with the judgments about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I think that this is a more global conflict, and I think that many people understand this. Two worlds are engaged in a struggle. One world is democratic, and another world does not understand what democracy is. And today this is a challenge for all the democratic countries, the countries of the modern world who think that values cannot be changed by force, that you have to fight to stand up for your values. And I do believe that peace will come, but it will be on our conditions. And this means just one thing: aggressors have to reject their own plans, the plans to kill, the plans to occupy it, the plans to be a danger, to be a threat. I always name an example, and this will be very apt today: the Yalta peace strategy, the Yalta European strategy. The Ukrainian Crimea, before the annexation, was a beautiful resort. The Ukrainian Crimea, after the annexation, became a super powerful military base. Do you feel the difference? And the difference is that Ukraine has never been a threat to anyone. So our task is like this: we should consolidate and we should draw together the entire world and make aggressors to refute their own plans, because every country in Europe, NATO countries, have to think over about who's next. And the understanding that the question who's next is on the agenda has to unite everybody.
Right. Thanks, Prime Minister. I'm going to take a couple at once, very quick ones. So make your questions brief if you can. Anders, and then we'll go over there.
Anders Åslund, the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for your beautiful speech about the reform. But the question here is it credible, as Stephen Sackur has already pointed out? How can we believe that it's really happening? Because the 5 leading reform ministers of the former government were ousted of the government. Without the leading reformers, or if the leading reformers are treated like that, will your good ministers really want to do reforms? And specifically, yesterday, as we were sitting here, the gas pipeline company Transgas was suddenly taken away from Naftagaz in a completely non-transparent way. The international financial institutions are very upset about this. Are you going to correct that? Thank you.
All right. Well, that's such a detailed question. We'll come to more, but just deal with that one straight away, if you would, Prime Minister, and if you can, as briefly as you can. But it is an important question. So,
I think that 5 people whom you talked about are very different, and we can, in a different way, put marks to their reform and capacity. And I think that in the Ukrainian government that I had, there's a reform in nucleus that are able to conduct reforms. And I think that our decisions are decisions of reform. And of course, you may see this, and the reformers are different, and to monopolize the right to conduct reforms is an exaggeration, I would say. So I think that in principle, we are looking at changes in a very pragmatic way, and we will conduct them, and we will conduct them fast. As for Naftogaz, the Ministry of Economy has adopted such a decision, but I can tell you that if we see at least one thread that this is not correct or that this should be changed, you shall have no doubt that the Prime Minister will react quickly and do everything to remove all the problems. But as of today, I do not have such a decision. I will look into this issue one of the next days, and I'll put a full stop to it, a full stop that will be in the interests of Ukraine and make this big Ukrainian company efficient and transparent.
Okay, next question.
Richard Risby, Chairman of the British Ukrainian Society. Prime Minister, I'd like to bring you on to the business and investment climate in this country. In 2008, when we had the financial crisis, in Britain we had an oligopolistic banking structure with very poor regulation. The popular thing to do at the time would have been to break up the banks. But what we decided to do, and it took longer, was to introduce competition. You can now actually open a bank account in a supermarket, etc., to liberalize the economy in this way. And this brings me on to the environment for business startups. Prime Minister, you have a huge asset in this country beyond your natural resources, which is your young people, who are well educated, who are IT savvy, some of whom sadly have chosen to leave the country. I want you to please encourage us and explain what you're doing to encourage business startups, to encourage an investment climate for young people to feel that they can share in the prosperity of this country by starting up their own businesses.
Thank you very much for your question. Really, I think that we have one of the best resources in our country, which is intellect, the intellect of the younger generation who try to do sufficiently interesting projects. There's a number of programs that stimulate and support such projects, but I would like to emphasize that the creation of investment climate is a key task for the Ukrainian state. I am meeting different business associations and representatives quite a lot these days, and I do feel to which extent the old system is still there, the system that does not allow to open the investment potential of Ukraine to the full. So we have in principle two tasks facing our government. We are rather quickly implementing the actions that allow to remove the tension and pressure on the investment. On the other hand, we have to form a more stable system that will allow to stimulate the attraction of new investment. And we are doing a lot to set up this month a special office for attracting investment that will be responsible for the innovative sectors of our economy. But we also face some issues that are more basic. We do have a lot of raw materials sector, and we have to change this. I think that there's a huge field for our actions, and we have to change this together. But I would also like very much that those people who invest hryvnias, dollars, or euros into Ukrainian economy, that they are successful, that we have not some singular cases of investment from the West, but we have this en masse. The more world companies we have in Ukraine, a quicker Ukraine reforms. That's why I'm talking about honest privatization. I'm talking about the changes replacing the management of state companies. We are introducing independent supervisory boards and other mechanisms that will allow...
President Kuchma, I think you have a question, so let's hear that.
Додаток до Олександра Коснівського, дуже коротке питання.
A very short question to add something to Alexander Kosnevsky. Ukraine, Russia, and your answer to unite the world to solve this issue. We are very closely following the information space of Europe and probably the entire world, and Ukraine is not there for the recent time. Russia is there in all its diverse faces, but if Europeans do not see our problems, will they unite? Thank you, Mr. President, for your question. Let me start with quoting from you. You said Ukraine, Russia. You said that Ukraine is not Russia, and this is a greatest difference. And the biggest fear in Russia, I think, is that Ukraine becomes successful. And I think that after Ukraine, there is a lot of changes that will be happening on the post-Soviet space. As far as for the agenda of media and media space, I do think that this is a policy of our enemy to move the focus of attention from Ukraine to other problems. When the aggression from Russia started, first we got military aggression, then we got energy aggression when they started to limit our energy resources, then economic aggression, and another kind of aggression, information aggression. But I would like to emphasize one thing here. The Western world is a democratic world, and Russia does not understand what democracy is. They have controlled media, they have absolutely controlled information flows, and that's why they try to change the European agenda. I would say that the attempt to remove Ukraine from European agenda is another step to destabilize Europe itself, because the question is who's next, and it would be very naive to think that the aggressor would stop at what they have already done. I think that the issue is more profound and broader. That's why everyone should understand that this does concern...
Right, we have just a few minutes left. There's a forest of hands in the middle, so you go, sir, and then we'll try and get to you right afterwards.
Prime Minister Volodymyr from Lazard, one of the most obvious comparative advantages of Ukraine would be agriculture. Several dozen million hectares of some of the best land in the world, a tradition, and yet there are significant financial problems in some of the largest companies. And even though some international companies have invested, much more can be done. So the question for you is, what is your plan for agriculture, in particular from the budget support, the infrastructure to be able to export agricultural goods, and at last, the complicated, difficult political issue of land ownership or leasing? Thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll just take one more while hands are up. Who's got the microphone?
Yeah, I've got it. Mr. Prime Minister, I'm Jim Brook of the Ukraine Business Journal. China is investing hundreds of billions of dollars in the Belt and Road, the Silk Road strategy, purely to get containers from China to Europe, which is the world's largest consumer market. You have the luck of being right next to Europe, but we hear horror stories about trucks taking 5, 8, 12 hours to cross the border. What is your government going to do to create a mini Silk Road to speed the traffic from east to west into the European zone?
Okay, so let's do agriculture first, Prime Minister. What is your plan to maximize the potential of Ukraine's agriculture? What reforms are you going to make?
I will start we're saying that really we do have an immense potential to develop agriculture. We today have, as one of the priorities of the government's work, we will support the development of small farming. I think that big holdings now are quite capable of fulfilling their tasks. So our task is to support the Ukrainian farming. As far as infrastructure is concerned, we have to modernize our port structure and autoroutes and railways, and we're working on this in order to also augment our export potential. I was also talking about processing of agricultural stuff. We have to increase this capacity, the more so that we have enough potential to do this. It is very sad that we lacked attention to this as far as logistics is concerned. Today, the infrastructure does need the overhaul and modernization, and this is within the priorities of our government. We changed the management of Ukrainian railway company, and the management is rather professional now, and it was independently appointed by our government, and this will provide us with an opportunity to form the strategy of developing railways in our countries, and this will work for the benefit of the Ukrainian economy. As far as the land ownership is concerned, it is a very disputable question in Ukraine, but I think that it needs solution. We have to do everything in order to avoid mistakes. We remember the start of privatization in Ukraine when national wealth became the wealth of a small group of people. So our task today is to build the relations in the way that the owner who is there now should be protected, and we form the full-scale market for the commodities that there are in Ukraine. I want to ask those who own land now, how do you see the way the market of land in Ukraine should function? Because no one asks those who own the land, and politicians try to substitute for them. But I think that Ukrainian legislation shall make the owners of the land richer, not poorer. That's why we will be very balanced, and we will offer different models which are there in the world, and there are dozens of those.
Just on the specific question of freeing up the flow of transportation and trucks to the West, to the rest of Europe, you've got a plan for that?
Беззаперечно.
We do. As I said, we have to modernize Ukrainian railroads. We have to develop our port infrastructure. Unfortunately, for the many years in the past, the potential of the former Soviet Union, even if you take the statistics of transportation of goods through Ukraine, they have decreased 3 or 4 times. And unfortunately, corruption have destroyed also our transit capacity. Modernization of railroad, modernization of rolling stock, the change and reconstruction of our port infrastructure, that would give us a chance to emphasize our logistic and transport capacity. And moreover, Ukrainian highways, which require substantial reanimation, so to speak, and that's part of our plans.
Prime Minister, thank you so much. I'm getting signals that we unfortunately have run out of time. I know there are lots of questions still on the floor, but that's always the way at this conference. Always the time beats us, unfortunately. But Prime Minister, it's been a real pleasure to meet you. I do thank you so much for being so patient with my questions and all the questions from the floor. And I'm sure everybody would like to thank you very much for coming here this morning. Thank you very much indeed.
Дуже дякую, шановні колеги, і бажаю всім нам успіхів.
Colleagues, and I wish you all the best.
Gentlemen, it's time for a coffee break. We're going to be back in about 20 minutes. So if you can be back in, we'll say 30 minutes. So 30 minutes and we're back in the room.